Us. Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us for Elders Climate Action's monthly national call. I'm Mark Cook, a volunteer with Elders Climate Action on our education team, responsible in part for these events. In just a minute, I'll introduce you to our guest speaker this evening. For those of you who are new to ECA and who may not be familiar with us, we are great aunts and uncles, grandparents, and everyday folks determined to leave a livable planet for future generations of all life. Our programs, communications, and chapters are focused on engaging elders in building the personal and political will needed to respond to the climate crisis. At ECA, we are elder-centered and volunteer-driven, seeking to inform, inspire, and engage older generations to take actions on the climate crisis at the local, state, and national levels. Artificial intelligence and the data centers that they rely on and turbocharge the growth of are controversial current topics. Last summer, Time magazine had a cover story on the 100 most influential people in AI. Priya, tonight's speaker and co-founder of the organization that is actually named Climate Change AI, grabbed my attention. When I emailed her with no prior contact, she generously replied. In a 2014 interview, the author, poet, and environmental activist Margaret Atwood, also known for The Handmaid's Tale, was quoted as saying, "I don't call it climate change. I call it the everything change." Artificial intelligence is yet another common two-word phrase that could be better worded, but like climate change, may also be everything change. So, asking Priya to talk about the interchange of two things that are both everything change doesn't narrow down the possibilities very much. As Priya will better explain, AI takes different forms across many dynamic realms and all have environmental impacts you likely will have questions about. We will make time for answering questions after Priya's presentation, but feel free to post them to the Q&A as they occur to you, even as she presents. With that, please allow me to introduce you to Priya. She is an assistant professor at MIT in their Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and also their Laboratory for Information and Decision Systems. As previously mentioned, Priya is also a co-founder and chair of Climate Change AI, a global nonprofit initiative to catalyze impactful work at the intersection of climate change and machine learning for forecasting, optimization, and control in high renewables power grids to better balance electric energy demand and supply. Priya received her undergraduate degree from Harvey Mudd College with a major in computer science and math, as well as an emphasis in environmental analysis. Before starting her PhD, Priya traveled the world to study the people, technologies, and policies behind next-generation electricity systems. After that, Priya pursued and received her PhD from the Computer Science Department and the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Other accomplishments include recognition on the MIT Technology Review's 2021 list of 35 innovators under 35, Vox's, that's a V, not an F, Vox's 2023 Future Perfect 50, the 2025 Time 100 AI list I referred to earlier, and recipient of the Schmidt Sciences AI 2050 Early Career Fellowship. Finally, the 2022 Association for Computing Machinery Special Interest Group Energy Doctoral Dissertation Award. Okay, Priya, please take it from here. Thanks.
Right. Thank you guys so much for the kind introduction and for welcoming me into this group. I'm so excited to speak to you tonight, and yeah, hope that there will be tons of questions I'm excited to discuss. So before diving into kind of why AI matters for climate action, I do think it is important to step back and talk about what AI is. So AI really refers to any algorithm that allows a machine to perform a complex task. The kind of terming of artificial intelligence as opposed to natural intelligence comes from the fact that some of the origins of the field are in looking at tasks that we traditionally associate with human intelligence, things like speech, reasoning, and perception. But the kinds of tasks that actually fall under the umbrella of AI also extend to things like electricity demand forecasting, things that I don't know about you, but I don't sit around doing in my spare time mentally. Um, And so in reality, this term artificial intelligence, while it kind of hints at this particular kind of thing, actually could be termed, I think, as somebody also emailed ahead of the talk, as algorithmic intelligence or kind of in some sense like automatic reasoning in a broader sense. And within AI, there are kind of two big types of categories. One of these is rule-based systems. So these are techniques that automatically reason over an explicit set of rules. So for example, think about the game of chess. I think many of us could write down the rules of the game of chess, but very few of us would necessarily be good players of the game of chess. Because here, the hard part is not writing the rules down, it's figuring out what to do in the face of those rules. So rule-based systems work well in situations where we have a good sense of what the rules of the game, the rules of the system are, and we're solving over them is the hard part. The other big category of AI is machine learning. And machine learning works well in situations where maybe we actually have a good sense when kind of given an example of what the answer for that example is. So for example, if I have a bunch of images and I asked you to tell me which of these images is of a banana or not, you would probably be able to tell me that. But where the hard part is actually writing down a specific set of rules that codify that exactly to be put into kind of a traditional computational system. So machine learning works by basically getting a bunch of examples, learning automatically patterns in those examples. So for, is this image a banana or not? And then applying those learned patterns to a particular task. And today, most systems that we talk about AI are in this paradigm of machine learning, of kind of learning from a large set of examples to extract patterns. And so then in the news, we'll often hear about kind of, okay, machine learning models. So what is a machine learning model? So a machine learning model basically is the thing that transforms inputs into outputs. And it consists of a structure as well as parameters within that structure that can be adjusted. So a very simple machine learning model might be a line. A line is the structure, and the slope and intercept of that line are the parameters. So machine learning really is about this kind of set some kind of mathematical equation with parameters we can adjust. And then the kind of learning part of machine learning means that you actually figure out how to adjust those parameters through a process called training. And the goal is to pick those parameters in a way that does well in achieving some kind of task, like image recognition or producing a good solar power forecast. And this process of sort of specifying a model, of training the model, and so forth, can involve different types of data. So we would call these different data modalities. So things like sensors from the power grid or images or text. And this can also involve different kind of ways that you actually apply this paradigm of recognizing patterns. So for example, classifying is an image a banana or not. Regression is basically predicting a real value. So is my solar power generation normalized between 0 and 1? Kind of where in that spectrum is it? Clustering, which is basically taking a bunch of inputs and figuring out which ones are similar to each other. I imagine many folks have like used something like ChatGPT. That's a sort of next word prediction task, sort of given what words were before, figure out what words come next. And then reinforcement learning, which is used in settings where you have to control some kind of system. For example, how do I figure out how to charge or discharge my battery in when it's connected to my power grid? So I basically kind of give this overview to emphasize 2 points. One, in some sense, the kind of nitty-gritty of what's going on in machine learning is not rocket science. It's actually all these components that we can really kind of understand. And the second is that AI is not kind of one thing. There are very different ways in which it actually plays out and gets instantiated. And as I'll get to, these have very different impacts depending on the particular form of AI that you're using. For example, in the news, you'll often hear about this distinction between large versus small models. So what this is referring to when we hear large versus small is the number of parameters in a model. So the last slide I was saying parameters are the things you're adjusting within a machine learning model. And so there's a very wide spectrum in terms of the number of parameters of a model. Small models that have a few hundred parameters, for example, can run in seconds on most laptops. What I'm showing on the slide here, these sort of, 6 to 7 lines of code, is actually the full set of code needed to kind of load and train a machine learning model, a kind of a simple type called a random forest classifier. And this can be done on a laptop. It's very simple. And kind of a lot of models that are used, for example, in the climate space would fall into this category, just very simple to run, very small. Larger models with maybe kind of a few thousand to a million parameters might require using kind of one server. So, for example, one graphical processing unit or GPU running for half a day. And then very large models, the types that you hear about from kind of the OpenAIs, Anthropics of the world, those might have, billions or trillions of parameters. And those might require kind of 10,000 plus GPUs running for several months. These are the kinds of models that you're often seeing driving the data center growth that we're seeing right now. And so the plot on the slide is basically showing on the x-axis some metric for the size of a model, kind of the number of operations that it's running. And the y-axis is showing for a particular task of image recognition, the accuracy of that model. And the kind of bubble size is showing something about kind of the impact of running that model as well. And what you can see kind of on the right, as you kind of go rightwards on the plot, is that at first performance goes up. As you kind of invest in a bigger model, performance gets a bit better. But after a while, it levels off or even gets worse. And so kind of there's this narrative out there that like a large model is always a better model to use. And this is not necessarily the case. Even if you don't necessarily care about the emissions coming from these models, from a performance perspective, you don't always want to use the biggest model. And yet this is the narrative that is often coming out in public. So yeah, so basically here, there's again, like a different kind of choice we can make, large versus small models. The last kind of example I want to give of different types of AI models is task-specific versus general purpose models. So a task-specific model, as you can maybe guess from the name, is trained to do only one task, to do only one thing. So here, for example, we might have a task where the goal is to take a kind of satellite image and figure out what parts of the image relate to agriculture or commercial use or residential use or kind of something else, different types of land use. And so here you might take a machine learning model, give it images, satellite images, give it some label about kind of what the different land use types are in that image, and train it to do this one specific thing. Another type of model is called a general purpose model. And this is a model that tries to handle many different types of tasks. So for example, maybe from the same image, you want to understand what the different types of land use are, but maybe kind of in a time series of images, sort of images taken over time, you also want to understand how land use has changed over time, detect when kind of something switches from, for example, a forest to farmland. And so here, one approach you might take is to say, I'm going to actually try to capture both of these things within one model. I'm going to pass in data about both things and try to get the model to learn to do both things. So kind of in the public discourse right now, there's a lot of focus on general purpose models, but task-specific models also exist. They are the types of models that have actually been used for quite a long time. And again, kind of the sort of bigger or more general purpose you make your model, the kind of more implications it has for the kind of energy use and emissions associated with it, a point I'll come back to. So the takeaway of this initial part before I dive into kind of the implications of AI for climate action is essentially that AI is not just one thing. Kind of saying like AI is one thing is like saying groceries are one thing. In reality, right, if we kind of invest more resources in growing apples versus growing oranges versus producing ketchup, we're actually going to be putting in kind of very different types of resources like fertilizer, human inputs, etc. And the things that are served on the other side are also different, right? Whether you get an apple pie or kind of something on the side of your fries. And so basically kind of we AI similarly, when we have different types of models, it takes different types of things to foster those. And also the uses for different types of models differ on the other side. And so we have choices as a society regarding what types of models we foster and develop and how we use them. And this has a lot of implications for the direct resource use of these models, which applications are actually likely to benefit. So, what things we're actually able to do with these models, and also who is likely to benefit from the use of these models. And so, with that kind of upfront context in mind, I want to dive into now this intersection of AI and climate change. The key takeaway here is that you'll often hear kind of parts of this narrative. Oh, AI is going to save the climate, or AI is going to destroy the planet because of its direct resource impacts. And I want to emphasize that these effects are all important to pay attention to, and I'm going to dive into them, but also they don't necessarily tell the whole story as well. And this has implications for how we as a society act on climate. So first, I want to dive into AI's applications for climate action. So several years ago, a group of co-authors and I kind of sat down and tried to assess this question of, where can AI be used for climate action? And we did kind of a very large survey across many different sectors, including electricity, agriculture, forestry, heavy industry, climate prediction, societal adaptation applications, and so forth, in order to try to understand kind of where these tools may play a role. The result was this paper called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning, which, if you're interested in kind of diving into more details of what I'll talk about, I would encourage you to check out. And this paper also has some summaries online. So in this paper, we identified kind of 100 plus applications where AI could play a role across different areas. And while I won't be able to go kind of point by point through each of these applications, what I hope to do today is give a sense of some of the general themes that come up when thinking about these applications. So one common application that comes up is distilling raw data like satellite imagery into actionable information. For example, when we think about trying to actually build emissions inventories globally in order to inform, global climate negotiations, gathering ground up data to do these emissions inventories is actually really time and labor and money intensive. And as a result, it's not something that kind of every country and every context is able to do very scalably. So several years ago, there was a nonprofit coalition launched called Climate Trace, which essentially tries to take publicly available satellite imagery alongside on the ground data and use AI to essentially find patterns in that data in order to detect at the emitter level kind of what the extent of emissions are and kind of where they're coming from. And this basically is a strategy where when we don't have on the ground targeted data, but we do have a large kind of proxy data set like satellite imagery, we try to basically turn our kind of rough proxy data set into something more actionable that gives us that on the ground insight like emissions information. And so this theme comes up across many different applications, including using satellite imagery to detect deforestation, or similarly using satellite imagery to detect the locations of solar panels or the locations of buildings and the types of buildings in order to understand kind of what our building stock looks like and what the energy efficiency characteristics of our building stock might be. Another major theme that comes up is improving predictions. So on a power grid, for example, when we have kind of more a goal to integrate more renewable energy like solar and wind in order to decarbonize the power grid, the amount of power produced by a solar panel or a wind turbine varies based on the weather. And having the ability to better predict this allows us to better manage our power grids. In particular, actually on a power grid, you have to maintain an exact balance between the amount of power you're putting in and the amount of power you're taking out at every single moment. So having a better prediction of how much solar power you're going to get is actually critical to being able to integrate that effectively into the power grid. So the image on the slide is from a nonprofit called Open Climate Fix, which basically took to the challenge of developing machine learning based forecasting models for the UK power system operator, now called NESO. And what they did is they did two things. One, they kind of used more advanced models. So they used sort of a spatiotemporal transformer, which is able to take into account the relationship between how the correlations between different places in space and different places in time. And they also started being more clever about what data they were using for their solar power forecasts. So they were previously only taking in weather data and kind of historical data about how much solar power is produced, but they also started integrating satellite and aerial imagery about cloud movement, which has a big effect because if you're shading your solar panels, that can really cause a very sudden drop in solar power production. So they essentially were able to kind of take all these different data sources, feed them into a machine learning model, which was able to learn patterns and relationships between those in order to output better solar power predictions. And in doing that, they were actually able to cut the error of the UK power grid operators' forecasts in half compared to what they previously were. And so this theme comes up not just in renewables, renewable power prediction, but also things like predicting transportation demand or predicting extreme events. Basically, the ability to take in kind of very different types of data that are all informative for your prediction and put them together in a way that you can powerfully leverage the relationships between those types of data. So the last two themes I talked about have to do with kind of providing information to a decision maker. In order to kind of help them act on it. There's in limited settings, AI and machine learning can also be used for quote unquote automated decision making. So actually optimizing or directly controlling some kind of engineering system. For instance, AI and machine learning at this point are fairly widely used to optimize heating and cooling systems in buildings. And the idea is basically that by whereas before you would just set some kind of rough cut rules for your heating and cooling system that would try to keep the temperature within bounds, but maybe be wasteful. AI and machine learning can be used to take in information about things like the outdoor weather, whether a building or a room is occupied at a particular point in time or not. And then basically combine that to come up with a more nuanced control policy that allows you to kind of maintain thermal comfort when the building is occupied, for example, but maybe not waste cycles when the building is not or when the temperature is already okay. And this theme of basically taking in, again, like different types of sensor data and trying to find nuanced patterns to allow us to optimize systems more efficiently also comes up in power grid optimization and even the optimization of freight auction systems. Similarly, another kind of efficiency application that comes up is predictive maintenance. The idea that we can, in an operational or infrastructure system, try to identify inefficiencies or breakages either before they occur or in near real time in order to fix them as quickly as possible. So the image on the slide is from the German train operator Deutsche Bahn, which uses AI to essentially take in information from the switching infrastructure on their system and then analyze it to see if anything weird is going on, if there are any anomalies at any given point. And by doing that, they can basically kind of identify maybe even before equipment fully goes out when it's starting to degrade and fix it ahead of time. And this basically helps them keep the trains running more so on time. In addition to helping us with operational systems, AI can be used to help accelerate the process of scientific discovery for things like next generation batteries or clean fuels or CO2 sorbents that we kind of, want to create as better technologies to help us act on climate action. So the image on the slide, for example, is from a paper that is testing different charging protocols for electric vehicles. And the thing that machine learning is doing here is taking in information from past experiments where they tried cycling batteries, for example, and then using that to basically help recommend which experiments should be tried next in order to kind of speed up the process of experimentation and kind of cut down the time to get to that better battery charging protocol. Similarly, there are kind of many places in climate and energy workflows where we need to run these very time-intensive physical simulations. So climate models, right, that try to predict what the climate is going to do in the future, very time-intensive physical simulation. For power and energy systems, we're trying to run models to figure out how to plan where we're going to put renewable capacity and power lines in the future. Those are also intensive simulations. and even city planning models where we basically want to model the flow of kind of wind, fluid flow through a city to understand the energy efficiency characteristics of the city. These are also kind of complex physical simulations. So these are situations where AI can actually help reduce the complexity and emissions associated with these simulations, either by learning an approximation to the overall simulation or by allowing us to better work with the outputs of that simulation. So the image on the slide is indicating an application called climate model downscaling, where we essentially take the output of a climate model, which might give you a very kind of a prediction at a very large spatial coarseness. So like one predict or a couple of predictions, like three predictions for the entirety of the state of New York. And then basically tries to learn the relationship between those coarse climate predictions and more granular weather data that we have on the ground historically. And so that when we get a future climate prediction, we can figure out, okay, what is the more granular weather prediction that implies. So basically post-processing the outputs of these intensive simulations. The last application I'll talk about is kind of, AI and machine learning kind of, leverage data. But AI and machine learning can also help us process data itself. So for instance, there's a cooperative in the US called the Catalyst Cooperative, which focuses on cleaning up federal energy data in order to make it available to researchers, analysts, activists in order to advocate for a cleaner energy system. And what they find is that in different federal data sets, the same power generator is not referred to by the same identifier. And that makes it difficult when you're trying to actually merge these data sets to actually get integrated insights about power generation and emissions from different data sets, that's difficult. So they actually used machine learning to automatically match records in different data sets to enable them to do this kind of analysis. Another kind of data management application is called scenario generation. This idea that we might have historical data on things like wind power patterns, but we might want to learn some structure in that data to kind of get some sample future wind power patterns. Like what could wind power look like in the future? And so the image on the slide is from a paper that essentially took kind of like historical samples of wind power production, used machine learning to learn a probability distribution over them, and then shifted the probability distribution intentionally and drew samples from it to come up with example future scenarios that planners could then use to envision what a future kind of wind scenario might look like. So one thing I want to emphasize as I kind of wrap up this very like whirlwind intro to AI for climate is that hopefully it's kind of clear from the way I'm describing these. The types of models that are being used in these different applications or the ways that these models are being used are very different. You have some models that are processing satellite imagery or time series data or physical simulation outputs, some that are being used to predict, some that are being used to optimize. Many of these are task-specific models. Some of them are general purpose models. And ultimately, kind of these models need to be developed in a way that is actually meeting the requirements of the application on the ground. So for example, my research group at MIT, what we work on is kind of machine learning for power grid optimization and control, where here actually making sure that our model outputs are safe, that they're not violating the physics of the power grid is extremely important because otherwise you're basically blacking out or causing large scale outages on the power grid. So our work focuses on kind of developing models that look different, that are designed specifically to incorporate knowledge of power grid physics or constraints within the machine learning model itself so that we get models that are safe by design. And so I bring this up to basically say that I think the types of AI and machine learning that we often want to encourage in order to actually make progress on climate applications are very tightly tuned towards the actual needs and requirements of those, whether that's physical feasibility and safety or interpretability or data efficiency or so forth. And it is often not the case that generic AI models developed in some other settings just sort of automatically have benefits for climate. It takes a very different kind of approach to kind of develop AI that is specifically geared towards climate applications. So that was a whirlwind tour through kind of AI's use for climate action. And I now want to kind of switch to a different topic at the intersection of AI and climate change, which is the kind of impacts from AI computation and hardware themselves. So Here, I'll kind of mention there are two major categories of impacts from direct impacts from AI. So one is kind of operational impacts. So the impacts that come when you're actually running a model in terms of the electricity consumed by those computations or the water that is used to cool the data center because those computations are sort of producing heat. Um, and then the other category is embodied emissions. So these are often kind of the emissions or impacts associated with the actual hardware in terms of producing that hardware, the hardware kind of being transported to where it is. And this comes with kind of, emissions impacts, materials impacts, and so forth. So a couple of things I want to mention here. One kind of maybe again like a theme that's coming up throughout the talk, different models can have actually very different orders of magnitude of impact. So the image on the slide here is showing the size of different models, on a log scale. And then the y-axis is showing the emissions of the models on a log scale. And what the colors are indicating is basically different types of tasks that the models are being used to do. So things like going from text to kind of classifying some category, or going from text to generating an image, or going from text to creating other text, or so forth. And essentially, what you end up seeing is that two things tend to drive the emissions associated with the model. One is the model size itself, and you kind of see as model size goes up by an order of magnitude, the model emissions also go up by kind of an order of magnitude. So there's a fairly direct relationship here. Um, and then the other thing is the type of thing that you're trying to use the model for matters. So here they found that methods that were trying to go from like text to image, like applications that were trying to go from text to image, were less emissions intensive than things that were trying to go from image to category. So image to, is this a banana or not? And this has to do with the combination of, again, the size of the model, but also the nuances of how the model is sort of trained and used in that context. That said, so even though there is a kind of a diversity of model sizes, and in some sense we have a lot of choice over the types of models we develop, right now there is societally at a macro level a huge push to kind of uh, put forward these very large kind of general purpose, trillion parameter, frontier, I'm going to throw out more buzzwords, but these kinds of models. And this is causing a fairly rapid growth in electricity demand. So the image on the slide is from a plot from the IEA, from the International Energy Agency, which is basically predicting forward the global electricity demand from data centers, AI, and cryptocurrency. So admittedly bundling a bunch of things here, but kind of trying to give a general sense of what does computational demand growth look like in the future. And what they predict is that there will be an approximately 2 times increase between kind of 2019 and 2026. And this came out in 2024, but there's always a bit of a data lag. So we don't know if these numbers are actuals as of yet. But they were predicting about like an over 2x increase during this period. If we contrast that with a kind of previous period of similar length from 2010 to 2018, during that time, we only saw kind of a 6% increase in electricity demand. And this is despite the fact that we were using more compute. During the same period, we had a kind of 5 to 6 times increase in the number of compute instances that we were actually launching. And so the difference is that historically, we were seeing, even though the amount of compute we were using was growing, hardware was also getting much more efficient. And hardware was getting efficient at a similar rate to match the kind of growth in compute. And now we're not seeing that anymore. It's both that kind of where our hardware is not getting efficient at quite the same rate, and the kind of the extent to which we're using compute is growing a lot more. So now there's a mismatch, and that's causing a total growth. So something definitely that is important to be aware of and do something about. One argument that comes up when people sometimes look at these curves is, well, I mean, that's just electricity use, so can't we just green the grid? Can't we just put renewables onto the grid? So no. And kind of the important points there are, one, kind of we're trying to decarbonize kind of the entirety of our electricity use. That means things like we want to put previously fossil fuel transportation, we want to electrify it and put it onto the grid. We want to take buildings that used to be fossil fueled and put them onto the grid. And we also want to support for kind of economies that haven't had the opportunity to kind of develop historically. We want to support electricity use to help that development. All of these are in some sense competing uses for the power grid. And if we kind of allow unbridled load growth from every source, there isn't necessarily kind of a nice, credible economic pathway to then kind of install renewable energy that is able to serve all of that load. So essentially, energy efficiency and actually being cognizant about where we're allowing load growth and why is important. And so it's not just about sort of greening the data centers that happen to come into play. We need to think about holistically what is the energy and load that can be supported across different sectors. In addition, it's not just about electricity. As mentioned before, data centers come with water implications. So many technology firms, for example, draw from public water aquifers. And in many cases, data centers are sited in places where there might already be regional water stress. And so even though these are localized effects, they're important effects for the people who live in that locality. And then even though we often think of AI as this thing in the cloud, there is a very material impact to kind of the hardware and resources that are used to actually power these algorithms. And so the kind of both sustainability and environmental impacts of those minerals, but also, I mean, minerals also come with often power struggles, conflict, war, right? So these implications are also really important in order to keep in mind when we think about this picture of AI's direct impacts. So that was my whirlwind tour through kind of the direct impacts from AI computation and hardware. And I want to wrap up by basically kind of talking about the other impacts, the other types of impacts that I think aren't often talked about, but are a very important part to round out this narrative. So one of them is AI applications that increase emissions. So AI is a general purpose technology, and as a result, it's used in society in all sorts of ways that not just benefit climate action, but also hurt climate action. So, for example, AI is widely used to accelerate emissions intensive industries like oil and gas in order to kind of make production more efficient, for example. And in some cases, a report that came out from Greenpeace several years ago notes that AI has boosted production levels in some cases as much as 5%. Could potentially generate, hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue for the oil and gas sector, sort of enriching that sector in a way that maybe entrenches its existing role. And not mentioned on the slide because I couldn't find a report that kind of spells it out, but definitely kind of things I've been told anecdotally by oil and gas folks is that there were certain cases where a particular oil field might not have been economical to extract from, to produce from. And then because of the efficiency gains coming from things like AI, it became economically viable to extract. And so there are all these effects where AI is basically bolstering the existing fossil fuel economy. It's not just fossil fuels, though. AI is, for example, used in things like the Internet of Cows, which is a kind of use of Internet of Things technologies to better manage bovine livestock at scale, therefore kind of entrenching the role of bovine agriculture and kind of the greenhouse gas and methane emissions that come with it. So the last kind of piece of AI's impacts that I want to talk about is its sort of system level impacts, the kind of ways that business as usual AI applications that we don't necessarily think of as immediately climate relevant still shape our ability to act on climate. So for example, AI is kind of a driver, no pun intended, behind autonomous vehicle technologies. And autonomous vehicle technologies are often being developed in ways that entrench the role of private fossil fuel transportation. And that directly has implications for our ability to decarbonize the transportation system if we're trying to switch to more kind of low carbon and multimodal transportation. So the kind of implications that AI has for some of our infrastructural systems that are the same infrastructural systems we're trying to decarbonize ends up having important implications. In addition, AI is very much shaping the way we consume information online. It's shaping how we consume goods and services through things like on-demand delivery. And it's also shifting who holds power in society as we increasingly see things like technology vendors being the ones to vend to city governments who want to create smart cities for sustainability reasons. And now all of their data is now kind of in the system of some technology provider who now has some form of capture and power over that city government. So these kinds of system level impacts, I think, are also important to keep in mind alongside this broader picture. Because when we think about what should be done at the intersection of AI and climate, I think it's very easy for certain companies to look at this and say, oh, I'm going to green the grid and then I'm going to kind of do some AI for social good applications and that's it, while kind of not talking at all about their business as usual AI applications and the ways that those also need to actually change in order to align with climate goals. And so I think keeping this holistic picture in mind is important from that perspective. So in terms of what can be done, I think there's a lot that actually can be done. So I talked earlier about this paradigm of application-driven innovation, the idea that the way we actually develop AI methods and kind of invest in innovation in this area should be driven by the needs of actual climate applications and should kind of cause us to develop AI methods in a way that serves the needs of those applications rather than necessarily over investing in AI for generic commercial applications that may not have societal benefit. And so this kind of shapes maybe where we put our governmental research funding and kind of industrial efforts and such, and where kind of, we as citizens can also kind of, use our vote or use our civic voice to help shape these kinds of things. In addition, of course, what we work on and how we work on it. So it's obviously ideally doing more of the AI for climate stuff, less of the AI for anti-climate stuff, but also more broadly thinking about ways that we can even shape the impacts of applications that we're doing business as usual right now to be more aligned with climate. So things like when we're doing things like developing autonomous vehicles as a society, can we actually change the way we're doing that? Can we do more like autonomous public buses kinds of work to actually bolster the public transportation system rather than focusing so much effort on entrenching the private transportation systems that we often have in place today? There are also lots of practices that can be taken at individual and organizational levels to do things like internally in an organization, maybe actually have some internal carbon price, which some companies have put into place so that you're explicitly taking into account what the carbon implications of your internal practices are compared to maybe like the profit you're generating on the other side. And then a big other thing is public communication. I think right now there's still sort of a lot of communication publicly that where, let's say, leaders who are trying to sell AI technologies conveniently benefit from the fact that everyone thinks AI is one thing, and therefore they can say, if you invest in my technology, everything will get better, climate will get better, health will get better. And they conveniently leave out the fact that it's not necessarily their type of AI that is being used within those applications. So I think kind of public education and public communication are really important there. On the public policy sphere, I think there are lots of things that can be done to both foster the use of AI for climate action more effectively by investing in better kind of digital public goods like data and infrastructure that is actually reflecting important climate related tasks that need to be carried out so we can better develop methods for that, in addition to kind of better targeting research and innovation funding and dealing with thorny deployment questions like how do you kind of deploy and develop AI for safety critical systems like the power grid when you really need to do something different to incorporate renewables, but it also, understandably, those methods that you deploy need to be robust. And then more generally, I think there's a really important need to foster greater transparency on the ways that different entities are using AI, focused not just on focused on both the kind of specific models and the implications and emissions and energy use and all of that associated with specific models, in addition to the impacts of the things that entities are using these for. And I think there are ways that governments, for example, can play a role doing things like governments often don't want to regulate, like, you shouldn't use AI for this because they don't want to be seen as stifling innovation, but they themselves are often procurers of technology. So a government setting a procurement policy like, I'm only going to procure AI technologies from organizations that have set a net zero target covering their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions now sets a powerful incentive for certain entities who want to be able to vent to the government to do these things internally. So I think that there are ways that kind of governments can use their kind of collective role as a purchaser, for example, to drive some of these changes. And again, where we as the citizenry can really kind of advocate to have those kinds of things happen. So last but not least, I'll kind of mention that if you're interested in this general topic of AI and climate change, I would definitely encourage you to engage with the climate change AI community. So Climate Change AI, as Mark mentioned at the beginning, we are a nonprofit that really tries to enable the impactful and responsible use of AI for climate action, both by enabling positive uses and by more broadly trying to enable societal shaping of AI in directions that are aligned with our actual climate goals. And so there are various ways to kind of get involved. We are going to be running a virtual summer school this upcoming summer, which is meant to provide an entry point into the AI and climate space for people who are coming from either the AI side or the climate side, and who are looking to learn about the intersection by providing kind of a basis on like fundamentals of AI. And responsible AI, as well as overviews of the ways AI can be leveraged across different climate relevant sectors. And then we also have kind of, tutorials, a workshop series, funding, an online community platform, various ways to essentially learn more about what's going on in the space, meet others, and kind of engage in dialogue and action together. And so with that, thank you so much for having me again, and I welcome any questions.
Okay, Priya, I want to be respectful of your time. I know we got a late start, and we had told you you could be off at the hour, so I don't want to run over, particularly if you have other obligations.
I'm
So,
I'm totally fine. I don't want to cut into your guys' action time, but I'm happy to stay and answer questions for a bit for sure.
okay, Jen, any thoughts on this? Should I just go through the questions as
Yeah,
they're
I
asked?
think go through. Let's go ahead and let's ask a couple questions, and then maybe we can get Kaylee to give us the action carousel link, and then maybe we could answer a couple more questions. Maybe we can kind of use the extra 15 minutes for a little bit of Q&A combined with action.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, why don't you ask a question or two, Mark, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so I'm going to just go in the order they came, unless somebody would like to do something different. The first question is there a model for sizing down a 5,000 acre data center to something smaller, proposed a suitcase? For example, early computers the size of a house versus a cell phone.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm truthfully not a hardware expert. I think there are people trying to do this, but I think the challenge is we're essentially hitting some of the limits of Moore's law, kind of the scaling laws that allowed us to size things down so aggressively in the past. And so while of course it's very hard to predict discrete technological innovations, maybe there's something we're seeing that'll come out that won't happen. I think the end of Moore's law point makes it more and more unlikely that we kind of are able to get that level of aggressive scaling down.
Yeah, I think earlier you mentioned that the hardware is not keeping up in terms of being efficient, I guess. Okay, the next question is, what is the status of predicting the impact of clouds on weather, which I understand is generally missing in climate models?
Yeah. And so, as far as I understand, and again, I'm not a weather prediction expert specifically, but there's kind of the three realms. There's like the very short-term weather prediction, there's like the medium and sub-seasonal scale, and then there's the long-term climate models. In kind of very short term, I think some of these models that are more explicitly integrating data on like cloud cover and things like that are able to use that more effectively to strengthen their their weather prediction. So I think that's good. I think the sub-seasonal scale just tends to be hard. You kind of get into this realm where weather is sufficiently chaotic, but you're also trying to be sufficiently precise that you're kind of, yeah, it's just like a difficult trade-off to navigate. So I think there in that sub-seasonal scale, I think cloud models specifically may not be like the major bottleneck. I think there might be something bigger. And for longer term climate predictions, I think there's still a lot of work being done given that kind of clouds are one of the greatest sources of uncertainty in climate models. And so, what has started to be done on the machine learning side is doing things like using machine learning to learn approximations for individual cloud models and then stick those approximations into the broader climate model so that the climate model can be run more quickly. And then this allows you to kind of try out different uncertainty parameters because now you have a faster model, so you can kind of account for the uncertainty and what's going on internally.
Okay. Next question is, what is the viability of placing large AI centers in the ocean powered by a large wind turbine and cooled with ocean water?
That is a great question. So I don't entirely know the answer to this, but sort of some initial thoughts. One is with the wind turbine, I think you would need to deal with the intermittency of the power generation resource. And the issue is that kind of not having steady power is money for these data center operators. If you're not running your data center for an hour or a day, you're losing like millions of dollars of revenue. And so I think data center operators are kind of trying to figure out solutions to have firm power that doesn't go out at any cost because fundamentally the power costs are such a rounding error compared to the revenue they're making. And then with ocean water, I think my understanding is that a lot of data center cooling technologies today actually require clean or near clean water. And that's why it's competing with drinking water because you're not like wanting to corrode or ruin the equipment. And so then I guess you would have to think about desalination, et cetera, which might get expensive. So I'm never going to rule out the possibility, but I think it's not necessarily a short-term solution that I'm necessarily seeing as like immediately viable.
Okay, thanks. Are there guidelines that we can share with the public during tabling events about how to use AI in ways that are most energy efficient?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, for for some of the publicly available models like the chatbots and things like that, I think that is difficult because they don't necessarily give you a ton of configurability. But I think there are some things like when you do a Google search now, you get a Gemini generated answer whether you want one or not. And so there are things like that where there's a way you can actually toggle whether you get a Gemini answer or a flag, I think you can put at the end of your Google search to see whether you get an answer or not. So that's not efficiency as much as just at least, let's say, like reducing default generative AI in cases where you may not be using it anyway, and then it's kind of consuming energy, for example. For people who are let's say public but like they're in the role of let's say like technology procurers or something, they have some say within their company. I think it's maybe more about leadership questioning this paradigm that somebody coming to them with the latest and greatest and biggest model is actually selling them the model that's the best for their specific use case. I think there's been a lot of stuff where it's like a technology provider will create this general purpose model. They can sell it scalably, but it's crappier for everyone compared to if they had just developed a model that was geared towards that specific company's use case. And then that model ends up being smaller and more efficient. So I think there it's like educating the procurers and companies to improve that efficiency.
Okay, next is I read the big actors, Zuckerberg, Musk, etc., may be planning also to depend on nuclear power because greening won't provide enough. Do you see that coming?
Yeah, so I think that like in some ways, right, like the fact that these entities and people are investing in nuclear power and trying to rapidly improve the technology, like small modular reactors and such, is like a good thing in some sense. But the issue in the near term is that the data center build out is coming so quickly that actors are procuring power right now. And that power is largely natural gas and on-site diesel. And once you build those things, you don't shut them down tomorrow when your nuclear or other solution is ready. Those are sticking around and having impacts for a long time. And so, in some sense, yes, and I recognize like nuclear itself is obviously a very controversial topic. So the sentiment about like is the investment in it like good at all is obviously going to be mixed. But I think it's sort of a long-term investment when a lot of these impacts we're locking in the short term for many years to come.
Okay. Considering the intermittency imposed by wind and solar, it would seem that a good weather prediction would be essential. It makes me sad to see that the government is closing the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado. They wondered about your thoughts on that. And before you get into that, it says another one of our folks said one thing you can do is check out the Climate Action Now app. The actions of the day this week focus on protecting the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So,
Yeah. I think that's so great that the actions this week focus on protecting it. And yeah, like obviously it's a huge travesty because I mean, yeah, obviously like from a climate perspective, but also like weather prediction is essential for everything. So it's honestly one of the dumbest things ever that has closed. But yes.
okay,
And
there's
Mark, I think that's a good segue into letting Kylie jump, or sorry,
okay.
Katie jump in and introduce herself and the Climate Action Now app.
Okay, well, before that, Kylie, I guess, Priya, I don't know how long you'll stay around, but I just do want to thank you on behalf of ECA for giving us your time and your answer, your expertise, and, please feel free to stay around as long as you'd like for this. But again, just thank you so much for
And
speaking to us.
and we probably have time for another question or two once Kaylee introduces the app and gets everybody
Absolutely.
started.
I'm happy to stick around for a little bit longer. So yeah, after Kylie yeah, introduces the app.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, that's my cue. Hello, everyone. I'm Kaylee Beam, Climate Action Now's Director of Content. Thanks so much for having me on, as always, on these national calls. I always enjoy getting to be a little part of all the wonderful things that ECA does. So let me just share my screen so that I can get you access to tonight's carousel and get you ready to take some action. Share my screen, actually. There we go. All right, so you should be seeing my screen now. As many of you know, this is our goal tracker. On the left side, we have this globe, which will fill in and iterate as we take action here tonight. And just like the last few national calls, the QR code and link on the right side of the screen will take you to an action carousel on the Elders Climate Action website rather than the CAN app. So if you want to access the carousel on your computers, feel free to type in the short link or click on it in the chat. And if you prefer to use your phone or tablet, just point your camera at the QR code box, wait for that little pop-up to appear, and tap on it to get to the carousel. Of course, if you've never used it before, you'll have to put in some basic information to take action, like your name, address, email, and personalized message. These are just things that we need in order to connect you with your elected official. And if you elected officials, but you're using the carousel for the first time, don't worry, you won't have to start from scratch. The carousel should recognize your email and prompt you to enter a verification code. And once you put that in, it'll take all your progress from you. So feel free to get started. Our goal is 100 actions. You'll see some advocating for, positive applications of AI in the climate space, like AI-supported weather forecasting, crop breeding, wildfire prevention. But we also have actions focused on, data center regulations, urging our elected officials to really start showing you ECA recommended actions to take. So that's all from me. And yeah, thanks so much for having me on as always.
And I think, yeah, Priya, you've been answering questions as you've seen them.
Yeah.
And
And there's one from Bill, which I think is the last one, which I think is best to answer verbally. So happy to do that one.
okay, yeah, I think you could do that while we're doing this.
Okay. So the question from Bill is, we need to make our use of energy more efficient. We did this with LED lights and heat pumps for heating buildings and homes. So to improve the grid and grid loads, virtual power plants have been proposed. So could AI help define models based on renewables and batteries for VPPs and communities that provide economic benefits to those in the community while also reducing costs for the power provider that runs the grid? And then Francis also responded, AI may be able to make VPPs more efficient, but current software running VPPs and are already running VPPs in Vermont and other areas. So yeah, so I think all of this is great. So with virtual power plants and kind of helping to kind of integrate different like renewable resources and kind of have them jointly present a firm load to the grid. I think this is extremely important and agreed that there are some places where software is already running these things. The challenge that's coming up with some VPPs is that as you start to try to model more devices that also might be like spatially distant from each other, you need to start running what are called optimal power flow models that basically aim to optimally control those resources in a way such that the flows on the power grid are also not exceeding the limits on what can flow along lines, etc. And these models are actually a bit expensive to run. so computationally expensive. So actually, some of the research my group does is trying to use AI to actually come up with faster approximations to some of these computationally expensive models in order to help kind of more efficiently manage VPPs at greater scale with more devices, et cetera. So I think AI is not kind of necessary in all cases here, but in cases where the computational optimization problem gets too expensive to solve quickly, that's where AI can play a role in helping to approximate it.
I had a question, Priya, just about how you came about to choose sort of the direction you've taken with AI, just out of curiosity.
Yeah, totally. So, I came into it from the climate side, believe it or not. So, as a high schooler, had this really awesome biology teacher who took the first week or two of our biology class and turned it into a climate and sustainability curriculum. And kind of learning about climate and the huge equity impacts it would have, as well as I kind of, my parents are of Indian origin, so I kind of grew up sort of very cognizant of equity disparities in different places. So that like lit a fire in my belly to work on climate. But then I went to a kind of STEM liberal arts school called Harvey Mudd for undergrad, where you take a kind of broad core curriculum. And I fell in love with my computer science classes and was fundamentally very confused because it wasn't clear at all to me then how climate change had anything, or computer science had anything to do with climate change. So I ended up kind of pursuing these interests in parallel for a while. So as you kind of read in my bio, did like a computer science major and an environmental studies minor, and was like very involved extracurricular wise in environmental things. And then kind of late in undergrad, I stumbled upon some work from some researchers in the UK who argued that AI and machine learning would actually be critical to managing next generation power grids with large amounts of renewables, because the sort of scale and speed and complexity at which we would need to manage power grids in order to accommodate these renewables was increasing in a way that was fundamentally difficult for prior tools to deal with. And so that's what sparked my interest in the topic. That's what kind of prompted me to go on that year-long travel via fellowship to interview people about power grids. And then I sort of started my PhD working on AI for power. And then during that time, I ended up meeting kind of some other folks, including my now co-founders of Climate Change AI, at a conference, kind of coming from different angles of themselves maybe being AI people who wanted to figure out how to work in the climate space, but didn't know kind of how exactly to get involved. Or alternatively, some people in my climate related department who were doing climate work and were seeing opportunities for AI to be helpful. Like one of my co-founders, she was doing freight transportation, freight related emissions tracking, and there wasn't on the ground data about freight, but she was like, can we use satellite imagery to count trucks and use that to get like freight emissions inventories? So she was seeing these opportunities, but not a lot of awareness among the climate community about those specific kinds of applications where AI could play a role. And so that then prompted my kind of entry point into this broader like AI and climate space, and kind of co-founding this nonprofit to try to get both AI people to understand kind of how they can effectively use their skills for climate, and then on the climate side to educate people about places where tools may or may not be useful for kind of accelerating their work. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that kind of takes care of it. Uh,
Yeah.
and I
Cool.
guess we've exceeded our goal.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
Kaylee, we blew that goal out of the water pretty easy tonight. We love it when we see lots of actions come through.
And I'm going to get a lot of
So sorry.
emails tomorrow from everybody I've contacted, so my email box will explode. Leave me alone.
I'm having some internet trouble today. So sorry about that. I'm resharing my screen now. But I'm gonna go off video and go on mute. Sorry about that, everybody.
No problem, but we love seeing 138 actions in 15 minutes or 13 minutes. We still got 2 minutes to go, so please get your
Even less
inactive.
than that. We
We gotta.
started at 5:05, I think. So this is
Oh, right.
incredible, everybody.
We got a late start,
Yay.
so that's an awesome turnout in a short amount of time. So keep taking actions. We will definitely be sending out the recording to this call tomorrow. Again, sorry for the late start and the confusion with the links on today's call. We apologize that that happened and hope that things like that don't happen in the future. But we'll get a recording to you and then links to Priya's slides and to any other links that were shared in the chat box. And then also links to tonight's action carousel, where you can continue to take action on this topic. But you can also always find a carousel of actions to take on the ECA website in our climate action carousel. So there's always more to be had, more actions to be had. A great thing to do while you're sitting at the dentist office waiting to be seen, or on the city bus, going to your dental appointment. So please take action. Priya, thank you so much for such an in-depth conversation on a really big topic, I think, right now, which is AI. And I think it's always nice to actually know that there's good application to AI. And I think what's important here is that we all have to remember and ourselves to sort of be intentional with how we use it, because there are places where it's really important in helping to solve the issues that we face. But we don't all necessarily need to be using it for our everyday applications.
Yeah, and Priya, also know that we're here and Climate Action Now, this app is here, and if there's something you need to have promoted and we can be part of that, please, let us know. You've done us a huge favor. We'd be happy to return it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And yeah, I'll probably send it to you guys, but I'll make another plug for if you're interested in kind of getting the more extended version of what was very much a whirlwind tour. I would definitely encourage you to check out the Climate Change AI Virtual Summer School, which will be mid-July through the end of August. So hope to see
Okay.
some of you there.
All right.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that we share that information out in a larger all ECA bulletin or something as well. So,
Amazing. Yeah, I'll be
yeah,
sure to send it along.
absolutely.
Okay.
Great.
Send it to us. Thank you so much.
Thanks so
Good night,
much, all.
Thanks
everybody.
for staying
Good
around,
night.
Priya. We sure appreciate it.
Absolutely. Congrats everyone on reaching the actions goal.
Yeah, great work, everyone. Good night,
Take care.
everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
Kylie. 155 actions. Thanks,
Woohoo!
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.